Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the 19th century's final echoes, finding ourselves in the heat-soaked streets of Melbourne in the year 1921. The city is thick with the scent of dried eucalyptus, and the sharp, metallic tang of the tram tracks that crisscross the pavement like silver veins. It is the 30th of December, a day where the sun hangs heavy and gold over the horizon, casting long, languid shadows across the limestone facades of the grand buildings. The air is not merely warm. It is a physical presence, a soft, dry weight that settles on the skin and makes the movement of the holiday crowds feel like a slow-motion dance through amber. This is a time of transition, caught between the old world and the new, where horse-drawn carriages still clatter over the cobblestones, while the occasional motor car coughs and splutters, leaving a trail of blue smoke in the shimmering haze. Listen closely, and you can hear the distant chime of the town hall clock, a deep, resonant copper sound that vibrates through the soles of your feet, marking the passage of a Friday afternoon that began with simple errands and ended in an enduring mystery. In a quiet corner of the city fringe, the house of Elizabeth Tirtschke sits in a pocket of relative stillness. Inside, the rooms are cool and dim, protected by thick curtains that filter the harsh Australian light into a soft, milky glow. We find 12-year-old Alma Tirtschke here, a girl described by those who knew her as soft in speech and even softer in manner. She is a picture of youthful obedience, her golden hair catching what little light manages to escape through the drapes. Her grandmother, a woman of strict discipline and deep affection, prepares a small task. There is a message to be carried, a parcel to be retrieved. The kitchen smells of cedar oil and yesterday's tea. Alma dresses for the journey into the heart of the city, pulling on her navy blue overalls over a crisp, white blouse that has been starched until the collar feels like a paper edge against her throat. She adjusts her white hat, its brim casting a gentle shade over her eyes, and prepares to step out into the furnace of the afternoon. Her grandmother hands her a few coins for the tram, the silver cool and smooth in her palm, but Alma, feeling the restlessness of the school holidays, decides she will walk instead, choosing the scenic path through the gardens where the trees might offer a brief reprieve from the glare. Alma's boots click softly against the sun-baked earth as she enters the Fitzroy Gardens. Here, the world changes. The roar of the city fades into a gentle hum, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of cicadas hiding in the bark of the great elms. The air under the canopy is green and moist, smelling of damp soil and rotting leaves. She walks beneath the sprawling branches of oaks that have stood for decades, their leaves rustling like silk ribbons in the hot northerly breeze. Every footfall is cushioned by the grass, and for a moment, the world feels vast and safe. She passes the statues that stand like silent sentinels among the flower beds, their stone skin warm to the touch. The shadows of the leaves create shifting, intricate patterns on her white blouse as she moves through the dappled light. She is in no hurry. The holiday spirit is infectious, and she dawdles just a little, watching the way the sunlight dances on the surface of the ornamental ponds. There is a peacefulness in her pace, the slow, steady rhythm of a child who believes that the afternoon will stretch on forever, an endless expanse of golden hours before the sun finally dips below the edge of the world. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Alma reaches the bustling intersection of Swanston Street. The silence of the gardens is shattered by the vibrant chaos of the central business district. The air is thick with the smell of roasting coffee, the leather of harness sets, and the sweet, cloying aroma of summer fruit piled high on the vendors' carts. She makes her way to the butcher shop of Bennett and Woolcock, a place where the air is noticeably cooler, smelling of sawdust and cold iron. Her uncle, John Murdoch, usually works here, but today he is absent. The cashier, a man with ink-stained fingers and a polite nod, recognizes the girl and hands over the parcel she has come for. It is a bundle of sausages and corned beef, wrapped tightly in thick, brown butcher's paper and tied with a coarse kitchen twine that bites slightly into her fingers. The package is cold against her chest, a damp, heavy weight that seeps through the fabric of her overalls. She thanks the man, her voice small and melodic, barely rising above the sound of the cleaver hitting the wooden block in the back room. With the parcel tucked securely under her arm, she steps back out into the blinding white light of Swanston Street, the heat hitting her like a physical wave as she begins the final leg of her journey toward her aunt's home on Collins Street. The walk along Collins Street is a struggle through a sea of humanity. It is the peak of the New Year's shopping rush, and the sidewalks are a mosaic of parasols, straw boaters, and long summer dresses. Alma is a small, solitary figure weaving through the towering adults. She stops to look at the shop windows, her eyes wide as she takes in the displays of fine lace, mechanical toys, and gleaming silverware. The light reflects off the glass in brilliant, blinding flashes, momentarily obscuring the faces of the people passing by. She feels the grit of the city dust between her teeth and the trickle of sweat at her temples, yet she remains patient, a quiet observer of the urban spectacle. She is seen by many. Witnesses would later recall the sight of a young girl with a white hat and a brown paper parcel, moving with a curious mix of purpose and hesitation. Some say she looked worried, others say she was simply tired from the heat. As the clock nears 3 o'clock, the shadows begin to stretch, long and thin, reaching out from the alleyways like dark fingers. She reaches the corner of Alfred Place and Little Collins Street, a place where the grand architecture of the main thoroughfare gives way to narrower, darker passages. The roar of the main street becomes a muffled echo here, and the air grows still and stagnant. At this corner, the world seems to hold its breath. Alma is seen one last time, standing near the entrance to an arcade. Her white hat a bright focal point against the gray stone of the buildings. To her left lies the entrance to a wine saloon, a place of low voices and the clink of glass, hidden behind heavy doors that keep the secrets of the afternoon. To her right, the narrow mouth of an alleyway beckons, a shortcut through the shadows where the sun cannot reach. The heat shimmer on the pavement makes the distance look like water, distorting the shapes of the people moving in the background. A man is noted by some to be nearby, a shadow among shadows, but in the chaotic swell of the holiday crowd, he is merely a blur in the periphery. Alma shifts the weight of the meat parcel, her fingers perhaps numb from the cold twine, and she steps away from the bright light of the main road. The golden hour is beginning, that time of day when the world is most beautiful and most deceptive. As she turns the corner, the vibrant colors of the city seem to bleed into the deepening grays of the laneway. One moment she is there, a small girl in navy overalls, and the next, she is gone, swallowed by the silence of the city's hidden veins, leaving behind only the fading echo of her footsteps on the sun-warmed stone. The sky over Melbourne on that Saturday morning, the 31st of December, 1921, was a bruised shade of violet and slate gray. The city was suspended in that fragile, aching moment between the deep slumber of a summer night and the restless awakening of a new day. There was a peculiar stillness in the air, a humidity that clung to the skin like a damp veil, carrying with it the scent of the nearby Yarra River and the faint, lingering aroma of coal smoke from the late-night locomotives. The grand buildings of Little Collins Street stood like silent sentinels, their ornate stone carvings obscured by the creeping shadows of the early hour. Down at street level, the cobblestones were still cool to the touch, smoothed by decades of foot traffic and the heavy wheels of horse-drawn carriages. In this quietude, every sound was magnified. The distant whistle of a steam engine, the rhythmic clop of a solitary horse, and the soft, rhythmic sweeping of a shopkeeper preparing for the day's trade. The transition from the old year to the new was supposed to be a time of hope, but as the first pale sliver of light touched the rooftops, a different kind of energy began to stir in the heart of the city, one that felt heavy with an unspoken dread. Tucked away from the main thoroughfares, where the light struggled to penetrate even at high noon, lay Gun Alley. It was a narrow, unassuming passage, a ribbon of darkness caught between the towering brick walls of the city's heart. Here, the air felt thicker, stagnant and cool, smelling of wet stone and the metallic tang of iron. The ground was uneven, a mosaic of mud and grime that never seemed to truly dry. As the dawn light flickered against the upper windows of the surrounding buildings, it cast long, distorted shadows across the alley floor, making the piles of discarded crates and rubbish look like crouching figures. This was a place for shadows, a shortcut for the hurried, and a hiding spot for the forgotten. It was a space defined by its anonymity, a crack in the city's facade where the order of the civilized world seemed to fray at the edges. The brickwork was stained with the soot of years, and the silence here was not the peaceful quiet of the suburbs, but a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to swallow sound whole. A man named Henry Arrington, his daughter by his side, moved through this narrow corridor. They were bottle collectors, scavengers of the night's revelry, looking for discarded glass to trade for a few pennies. His footsteps were muffled by the damp earth, until he reached a point where the alley narrowed into a sharp turn. There, amidst the detritus of urban life, he saw something that did not belong. It was a flash of pale, smooth skin, a stark contrast to the browns and grays of the mud and brick. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into the form of a young girl. She lay there with a terrible, unnatural stillness, her limbs pale against the dark ground. She was entirely unclothed, her body appearing to have been meticulously washed before being placed in this squalid grave. The sight was a violent intrusion upon the morning. There was no movement, no breath, only the crushing reality of a life extinguished in the shadows. Arrington's own breath caught in his throat, a sharp, cold intake of air as the realization of what he was seeing settled into his bones. The silence of Gun Alley suddenly felt like a scream. The news of the discovery rippled through the city like a sudden, chilling wind. By the time the police arrived, the sun had begun to climb higher, though it offered no warmth to those gathered at the mouth of the alley. Senior Detective Fred Pigott, a man often called Melbourne's own Sherlock Holmes, stepped into the narrow space, his heavy leather boots crunching on the grit. He and his team worked with a somber, methodical pace, their faces set in grim masks as they surveyed the scene. Every detail was recorded with a meticulous, almost painful slowness. The position of the body, the missing clothing, the haunting emptiness of the girl's expression. She was identified as Alma Tirtschke, only 12 years old, a child who had been sent on a simple errand to her aunt's house and had never returned. The brutality of the scene was a visceral shock to the officers. The discovery that she had been strangled and assaulted turned the morning's grim task into a mission of absolute urgency. The contrast between her small, innocent form and the squalor of the alleyway was a sight that would linger in their minds long after the sun had set on that final day of the year. As the details of the crime began to circulate, the mood of Melbourne shifted from festive anticipation to a roiling, white-hot fury. The newspapers seized upon the story with a fervor that bordered on the obsessive, their headlines screaming of the Gun Alley horror. The public, usually preoccupied with the coming New Year's celebrations, found their thoughts consumed by the image of the golden-haired girl in the dark alley. A sense of collective vulnerability settled over the city. If a child could be snatched and broken so close to the bustling heart of the theater district, then no one was truly safe. The Victorian police felt the weight of this outrage pressing down upon them, a physical force that demanded a quick and decisive resolution. The halls of the station were filled with the frantic energy of detectives, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and the frantic scratching of pens. The reward for information was quickly raised to a staggering £1,000, a fortune that whispered of the government's desperation. There were calls for justice that sounded more like calls for vengeance. The pressure was not just to find the killer, but to find him immediately, to offer a sacrifice to the city's wounded sense of security before the clock struck midnight and ushered in a year that now felt irrevocably tainted. The investigation moved like a slow, dark tide through the narrow streets of 1921 Melbourne, eventually washing up against the threshold of the Eastern Arcade. This covered walkway, a passage of iron and glass connecting Burke Street to Little Collins Street, was a place where the shadows seemed to linger even at midday. It was here, nestled within the arcade, that the Australian Wine Saloon sat behind its heavy timber doors. The air inside the saloon was thick, a viscous mixture of fermented grapes, stale tobacco, and the damp, earthy scent of cellar dust. Colin Campbell Ross, a man of 29 years with a burly frame and a face etched with the weariness of 1,000 late nights, stood behind the counter. He was the proprietor, a man who had only recently taken over the establishment with his brothers, hoping to carve out a living in a city that was increasingly hostile to those on its fringes. The saloon was not a place of refinement. It was a labyrinth of dim corners and small, partitioned cubicles where the light of the flickering gas lamps barely touched the floorboards. To the local police, who were already weary from the public outcry, the saloon was a beacon of suspicion, a haunt for the desperate and the dispossessed. They remembered Ross from a previous encounter, a shooting incident for which he had been acquitted, but the stain of that association remained. Now, as the news of Alma Tirtschke spread, the police began to look at the Australian Wine Saloon not as a business, but as a potential site of unimaginable horror. They watched the way the light glinted off the dark wine bottles, and they wondered what secrets were being swallowed by the silence of those small, private rooms. The pressure on the detectives, John Brophy and Fred Pigott, was immense. A reward of £1,000 had been offered for information leading to a conviction, a sum so large in 1921 that it could transform a life of poverty into one of security. It was a figure that hung over the city like a heavy, golden fog, distorting memory, and tempting the tongues of those who had nothing to lose. In the quiet of the night, the detectives pored over the statements of witnesses who claimed to have seen the young girl in her distinctive school uniform. They focused their gaze on the arcade, where several people reported seeing a child who looked anxious, looking over her shoulder as if being followed by an unseen presence. When they first interviewed Colin Ross, he was cooperative, even pointing out that he had seen a girl matching Alma's description passing by his door around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He spoke with a certain nonchalance, a man who believed his innocence was a shield. But the police saw something else in his burly stance and his history of minor transgressions. They saw a convenient target for a city demanding justice. On a cold morning in January, they returned to the saloon, their boots echoing on the polished stone of the arcade. They entered the premises not as patrons, but as hunters. They moved through the bar area, their eyes scanning the dark wood and the tarnished brass fixtures. They were looking for something, anything, that would connect the missing child to this house of wine and shadows. The detectives focused their attention on a small, secluded room off the main bar, a place where patrons could drink in relative privacy. Inside, the furniture was sparse, dominated by a couch covered in a series of thick, woolen blankets. One was a greeny-blue military blanket, its fibers matted and coarse. The other was a reddish-brown rug, heavy and smelling of wool grease and age. Detective Pigott leaned down, his eyes narrowing as a stray beam of light caught a glint of something nearly invisible against the dark fabric. He produced a small pair of tweezers and carefully lifted a single, fine strand of hair. It was a bright, golden red, a color that stood out against the muddy tones of the blanket like a spark of fire. He found more, 22 strands in total, scattered across the rug. To the detectives, this was the breakthrough they had been praying for. They did not have the tools of modern science, but they had the conviction that these hairs belonged to Alma Tirtschke. They imagined the struggle that must have taken place on that very couch, the muffled cries lost to the thick walls and the hum of the city outside. As they gathered the evidence, the atmosphere in the saloon grew heavy with an impending sense of doom. Ross watched them, his initial confidence beginning to fray at the edges like the very blankets they were seizing. He insisted the blankets were his own, that the hairs must have come from a regular visitor or perhaps his girlfriend, but his words seemed to vanish into the stale air of the room, unheeded. While the physical evidence was being processed, a new and more damaging form of testimony began to emerge. Ivy Matthews, a former barmaid at the saloon, came forward with a story that changed everything. Initially, she had told the police she knew nothing, but as the days passed and the reward money loomed larger in the public consciousness, her memory seemed to sharpen. She claimed that on the afternoon of December 30th, she had seen Alma inside the saloon, sitting in that very private room. She described Ross giving the girl a glass of wine, a detail that sent a shockwave of disgust through the city. Ivy's testimony was soon joined by that of others from the fringes of society. There was Olive Maddox, a woman who frequented the arcade, who claimed to have seen the girl in the cubicle at 5 o'clock. Then there was Julia Gibson, a fortune teller who went by the name Madame Gurkha, who whispered of confessions made in the dead of night. Most damaging of all was the account of John Harding, a man currently held in prison for perjury, who claimed that Ross had confessed the entire crime to him while they shared the exercise yard. Harding's voice was a low, conspiratorial rasp, as he told the authorities that Ross had admitted to strangling the girl in a fit of passion. These were the voices of the desperate, people whose lives were lived in the cracks of the city, now brought into the light by the promise of £1,000. Their stories were contradictory and shifted under questioning, but to a public blinded by fury, they were the gospel truth. The Australian Wine Saloon was no longer just a place to buy a glass of port. It had become a house of ghosts in the eyes of the Melbourne public. The newspapers, led by the sensationalist reporting of the Herald, painted Colin Ross as a predator who lured children into his den of vice. Every detail of his life was scrutinized, from his failed romances to his previous legal troubles, all of it woven into a narrative of inherent villainy. Ross found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making, unable to comprehend how the simple act of owning a bar near a crime scene had transformed him into the most hated man in Australia. He sat in his cell, the walls closing in, as the detectives built their case on a foundation of shifting testimonies and a few strands of hair. He thought of the quiet afternoons behind the bar, the clinking of glasses, and the mundane rhythms of his business, all of which now seemed like a lifetime ago. The city outside was a roiling sea of anger, and the saloon stood empty, a silent witness to a tragedy that was still unfolding. The investigation had found its man, but in the rush to satisfy the mob, the truth was being buried under a mountain of prejudice and the irresistible allure of the reward. The stage was being set for a trial that would grip the nation, a spectacle where the fine line between justice and vengeance would be blurred by the shadows of Gun Alley and the flickering lights of the Australian Wine Saloon. The air inside the house at Footscray felt thick and unmoving on that Tuesday in mid-January, 1922. Detective Frederick Pigott moved through the small, cramped rooms of the Ross family residence with a practiced, heavy-footed caution. Behind him, the summer sun struggled to pierce through the heavy curtains, casting long, pale shadows across the uneven floorboards. There was a lingering scent of starch, mothballs, and wood smoke, the mundane smells of a life being lived in the shadow of a brewing storm. As his hands brushed against the coarse, heavy fabric of a folded wool blanket resting in the living room, he felt a sudden, sharp prickle of intuition. The blanket was a dull, utilitarian thing, yet as he shook it out, the light caught something thin and shimmering against the dark weave. He leaned in closer, his breath hitching, and saw several strands of hair caught in the fibers. They were not the dark, coarse hairs one might expect from a grown man, but long, delicate threads of a striking auburn hue. To Pigot, they looked like spun gold reflecting the dust-moted light of the afternoon. He carefully folded the blanket back into itself, treating it no longer as a household object, but as a vessel for a ghost. He knew that the public was screaming for an arrest, and in his hands, he believed he held the first tangible bridge between the Australian wine saloon and the tragedy of Gun Alley. By the time the blankets reached the government laboratory, the atmosphere surrounding the case had reached a fever pitch. The laboratory itself was a place of cold stone and clinical silence, located far from the rowdy whispers of the Eastern Arcade. Here, the air was sharp with the smell of formaldehyde and the metallic tang of chemical reagents. Charles Price, a government analyst and chemist, stood over a wooden workbench that was worn smooth by decades of meticulous work. He was a man of science in an era where science was still learning its own boundaries. Before him lay 27 individual hairs recovered from the blankets, alongside a small, somber envelope containing samples taken from the scalp of young Alma Tirtschke during her autopsy. The task was unprecedented in the history of Australian law. Price began by preparing the slides, his fingers steady as he manipulated the tiny, fragile evidence with silver tweezers. He placed the samples onto thin glass rectangles, the clinking of the glass sounding like small bells in the quiet room. There was no precedent for what he was about to attempt. The microscopic comparison of human hair was a revolutionary frontier, a new and untested language that promised to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. He leaned into the eyepiece of his heavy brass microscope, the gears clicking softly as he adjusted the focus. Slowly, the microscopic world began to emerge from the blur. The strands of hair, which appeared so simple to the naked eye, transformed into complex alien structures under the lens. He saw the outer scales of the cuticle, the inner pigments of the cortex, and the central marrow known as the medulla. He spent hours in that hunched position, his eyes strained by the flickering light of the lamp. He looked at one hair from the blanket, noting its reddish gold tint and its specific diameter, and then he shifted to the sample from the girl. He was looking for a pattern, a signature written in keratin and time. In his mind, he was searching for the undeniable proof that would satisfy a hungry court and a vengeful public. He noted that while some of the hairs seemed slightly different in their width or the depth of their color, there were enough similarities to create a narrative. He ignored the fact that hair from a single human head can vary wildly in its characteristics. He was a chemist, not a biologist, and the weight of the moment began to press down upon his observations, coloring his judgment with the hope of a breakthrough. The details were painstakingly recorded in his ledger. He noted that 22 of the hairs from the blanket were of a similar auburn shade to those of the deceased child. He observed the way the light passed through them, creating a glow that he described as golden. The process was slow and hypnotic, the silence of the lab broken only by the scratch of his fountain pen on the paper. He began to form a conclusion that would change the course of the investigation. Despite the slight variations in length and thickness, Price became convinced that the two specimens were derived from the scalp of the same person. He did not consider the presence of other women who had frequented the saloon, nor did he account for the poor conditions in which the blankets had been stored. They had been tossed onto a desk in a busy police station, exposed to the dust and debris of a dozen different people. To him, the hair was a silent witness that could not be cross-examined. He saw the microscopic threads as a lock and key, a perfect fit that would secure the fate of Colin Campbell Ross. It was a leap of faith disguised as an objective measurement, a single strand of science that was expected to hold the weight of a man's life. When the news of the forensic match leaked to the press, the city of Melbourne felt a collective surge of dark satisfaction. The microscopic evidence was hailed as a miracle of the modern age. It was no longer just the word of a few witnesses of ill repute. It was the testimony of the very elements of life itself. The prosecution began to build their case around these 27 hairs, treating them as the cornerstone of a wall that was closing in on the owner of the wine saloon. In the cells of the old Melbourne jail, Colin Ross maintained his innocence, unaware that the most dangerous evidence against him was something so small it could be blown away by a single breath. The tragedy of the case began to shift from the horror of the alleyway to the cold, quiet corridors of the laboratory, where a well-meaning chemist was about to offer a flawed truth to a court that was not prepared to question it. The strands of hair were mounted on cards, ready to be presented to a jury as the final, undeniable proof. They lay in their boxes, silent and shimmering, a thin auburn line that led straight to the gallows, woven into a tapestry of justice that was beginning to fray before it was even completed. The air inside the Melbourne Supreme Court in February of 1922 was not merely hot. It was heavy, a suffocating weight that seemed to press the very breath from the lungs of everyone gathered within its mahogany-clad walls. The summer sun beat down upon the roof, turning the high-ceilinged room into a crucible where a man's life was being melted down to its base elements. You can almost feel the texture of the gallery benches, worn smooth by generations of the curious and the condemned, and the faint, metallic scent of floor wax mixing with the sharp tang of sweat and old wool. Justice Shutt sat high upon his bench, a figure of frozen stone amidst the swirling tempests of public outrage, his eyes scanning a room packed so tightly that the air felt recycled and thin. Outside, the city of Melbourne hummed with a different kind of energy, the clatter of iron-wheeled trams and the shouting of newsboys creating a distant, discordant soundtrack to the somber proceedings inside. In this space, time seemed to slow, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock measuring out the seconds with a mechanical indifference that felt like a heartbeat slowing toward its final stop. The prosecution's case was built not on ironclad proof, but on a foundation of whispers and shadows. They brought forward witnesses whose lives were lived in the margins of society, people whose words were bought with the promise of reward money. There was Julia Gibson, who operated under the mystical pseudonym of Madame Gurkha, her presence in the witness box casting a strange, supernatural pallor over the cold legalities. And there was John Harding, a man whose history was stained by the ink of perjury, claiming that Colin Campbell Ross had confessed his sins behind the iron bars of a prison cell. To the 12 men of the jury, these stories were woven together with the help of those few strands of auburn hair, presented as if they were threads of fate itself. Thomas Brennan, the defense barrister, stood as a lone bulwark against this tide of hearsay, his voice echoing through the chamber as he pointed to the holes in the Crown's tapestry. He looked at the microscopic slides and saw only doubt, yet the atmosphere in the room was already poisoned by a collective thirst for a resolution, any resolution that would quiet the ghosts of Gun Alley. As the trial reached its zenith, the tension in the courthouse became a physical entity, a low hum that vibrated in the floorboards. Colin Campbell Ross stood in the dock, his knuckles white as he gripped the polished rail, his face a mask of weary disbelief. He was a man watching a version of himself being constructed by strangers, a monster shaped from the ink of the Herald and the fevered imaginations of a city in mourning. When the jury finally retired to deliberate on the morning of Saturday, February 25th, 1922, the silence that followed was more deafening than any shout. The hours stretched into an eternity of gray shadows. When they returned, the verdict of guilty dropped into the room like a leaden weight, shattering the fragile hope that had lingered in the corners of the room. The public's reaction was a wave of dark satisfaction, a roar of approval that bled through the windows and into the streets, while Colin remained motionless, his eyes fixed on a future that had suddenly narrowed to the width of a rope. The transition from the courtroom to the old Melbourne jail was a journey into a world of cold bluestone and iron. The cell was a narrow ribcage of stone, where the walls seemed to weep with the dampness of the earth. In those final weeks, the world outside became a distant memory, a flicker of light seen through a high, barred window. Ross occupied his time with the scratching of a pen, writing letters that pleaded for a truth that no one was willing to hear. He spoke of his innocence not with the desperation of a liar, but with the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who knows he is being sacrificed to a lie. The gallows' shadow grew longer with every sunset, stretching across the stone floor of his cell like a reaching hand. The machinery of justice moved with a ponderous, irreversible grace, ignoring the petitions for mercy and the growing whispers of doubt that had begun to circulate among the more observant citizens. The air in the jail was still, a heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic pacing of the guards and the distant, lonely tolling of the city's bells. The morning of April 24th, 1922, arrived with a pale, sickly light that struggled to warm the frigid corridors of the prison. Colin Campbell Ross was led from his cell, his footsteps echoing with a finality that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the building. He walked toward the structure of timber and rope with a dignity that silenced his keepers. Standing upon the trapdoor, he looked out at the small assembly and spoke words that would haunt the conscience of Victoria for nearly a century. He swore by the Almighty God that he was an innocent man, that he had never seen the child, and that his life was being sworn away by desperate people. The rope used that morning was an experimental four-stranded cord, a detail that would lead to a gruesome and prolonged end. As the hood was placed over his head, the world disappeared into a coarse, dark void. The bolt was pulled, and the drop was swift, but the shadow he left behind would linger for 86 years, a silent, accusing phantom in the halls of justice, waiting for the day the truth would finally be pulled from the darkness. The passage of time is a slow, rhythmic tide that smooths the sharpest edges of history, turning once vivid tragedies into the soft, gray echoes of a forgotten era. For decades, the files of the Gun Alley murder lay dormant in the archives of Melbourne, resting in the cool, windowless embrace of heavy steel cabinets. The air in those vaults is still and thick, tasting faintly of ancient glue, cedar, and the metallic, biting scent of oxidized paper clips. Within these bundles of history, tied with fraying red ribbons, lived the ghosts of 1921. It took a quiet, persistent scholar named Kevin Morgan to stir the dust in the early 1990s. Imagine him there, sitting in the soft, amber glow of a desk lamp that flickers just slightly, his fingers tracing the uneven, brittle edges of witness statements. The silence of the archive room was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant hum of a ventilation system or the soft, dry rustle of paper against paper. He was not just reading facts. He was breathing in the atmosphere of a century ago, feeling the phantom chill of that winter morning when justice first began to unravel. The floorboards beneath his feet remained silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to finally look closer at the shadows. In 1995, hidden within a weathered archive box at the Office of Public Prosecutions, Kevin Morgan stumbled upon something that felt like a pulse from the past. It was a small, yellowing envelope, tucked away as if it were of no consequence. Inside were the very strands of hair that had sealed the fate of Colin Campbell Ross 80 years prior. They were fragile, almost ethereal, like spider silk caught in a beam of moonlight. In the original trial of 1922, the science had been primitive, a matter of looking through a basic lens and seeing only what the frantic public demanded to see. But these thin, copper-colored threads had waited patiently for the world to catch up. Morgan touched the envelope with a reverence usually reserved for sacred artifacts, his pulse quickening in the cold basement air. He knew that these tiny relics held the secret to a man's life and a girl's memory. The discovery was like finding a single, glowing coal in a bed of cold ashes, a spark of truth that refused to be extinguished by the weight of time or the finality of the gallows. The scene shifted from the dusty corridors of the past to the sterile, bright silence of the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. In 1998, the hair samples were placed under the watchful eyes of modern science. The laboratory was a world of white surfaces and the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of high-powered machines. Forensic experts moved with slow, deliberate precision, their gloved hands steady as they prepared the samples for mitochondrial DNA analysis. This was a search for the deep, invisible blueprint of life, a code that does not fade with the seasons. They looked through microscopes that could see into the very marrow of the hair, past the surface of the copper strands, and into the genetic history within. The process was slow and meticulous, a dance of pipettes and thermal cyclers that ticked away the seconds like a heartbeat. Outside the lab, the modern city of Melbourne hurried by, oblivious to the fact that a century-old lie was being dismantled in the quiet, fluorescent light. There was no room for opinion here, only the cold, beautiful clarity of molecular biology, waiting to speak for those who no longer had a voice. When the results finally emerged, they arrived not with a shout, but with a profound, heavy silence that seemed to settle over the city. The DNA from the strands of hair found on the blanket did not match the biological profile of 12-year-old Alma Tirtschke. The very evidence that had sent Colin Campbell Ross to the rope was proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, to be a tragic falsehood. It was a moment where the past and the present collided with a soft, dull thud. The realization rippled through the legal community, a cold wave of clarity that forced a reckoning with the ghosts of the old Melbourne jail. They looked back at the photographs of Ross, seeing his tired, hollow eyes in a new, devastating light. The injustice was as tangible as a weight on the chest, a thick fog that had finally begun to lift from the narrow lanes of the city. The research suggested another name, a relative of Alma's named George Murphy, a man who had lived in the shadows of the family's history. But for Colin, the truth had arrived 86 years too late. The weight of the error was immense, a burden of history that could only be lightened by a formal act of grace. On the 27th of May, 2008, the official pardon was finally granted. It was a landmark moment, the first and only time in the history of the country that a person had been posthumously forgiven for a crime they did not commit. The document was signed with a steady, solemn hand, the black ink soaking into the thick, cream-colored paper with a quiet finality. Outside the government buildings, the Melbourne rain fell in a steady, rhythmic pattern, washing the soot from the old stone facades and softening the edges of the pavement. The pardon could not bring Colin back, nor could it return the stolen years of little Alma, but it offered a strange, quiet peace to their descendants and to the collective memory of the city. The ghost of Gun Alley could finally stop pacing the narrow, cobblestone corridors. The narrative of the monster and the victim shifted into something more complex, a story of human error, the dangers of a rush to judgment, and the long, slow, inevitable arc of justice. The air in the city felt lighter that evening, as if a collective breath had been released after being held for nearly a century, the tension finally dissolving into the cool, dark night. The streets where Alma once walked are different now, paved with the glass and steel of modern life and lit by the soft, orange glow of street lamps. Yet the memory of the girl with the golden hair remains a soft, flickering candle in the darkness. We see her now not just as a tragedy, but as a reminder of the fragility of truth and the importance of looking closer. As we leave the cold stone of the prison and the dusty shelves of the archive behind, the sounds of the world begin to fade away into nothingness. The rhythmic ticking of a clock, the soft rustle of your blankets, the steady, peaceful rise and fall of your breath, these are the only things that matter in this moment. The mysteries of the past are settled now, tucked away into the quiet pages of history. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to fear, and nothing left to carry. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.